There was a time in America when carrying a $500 bill didn't make you suspicious. It made you powerful. Imagine pulling out a single piece of paper and casually paying for something worth hundreds of dollars. Not digitally, not with a card, but with a physical bill that most people today have never even seen in real life. The $500 bill wasn't a myth. It was real. It circulated. It was used. And then, almost quietly, it vanished. So what actually happened to the $500 bill? To understand that, we have to go back to the early 20th century, a time when the American economy was expanding fast and large transactions were often done in cash. This was before online banking, before instant transfers, before credit cards became mainstream. If a bank needed to move money or a business had to settle a large payment, they didn't click a button. They used physical currency. That's where high-denomination bills came in. The United States didn't just have a $500 bill. There was also a $1,000 bill, a $5,000 bill, and even a $10,000 bill. Yes, $10,000 printed on a single piece of paper. These bills weren't meant for everyday people buying groceries or paying rent. They were designed for banks, financial institutions, and wealthy individuals who needed to move large amounts of money efficiently. The $500 bill itself featured President William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't widely advertised, but it was powerful. At a time when the average annual salary in the U.S. was under $1,500, holding a $500 bill meant you were carrying a third of a year's income in your pocket. Let that sink in. So why don't we see these bills anymore? The answer lies in a mix of technology, crime, and government policy. By the mid-20th century, the way money moved started to change. Banks became more sophisticated. Wire transfers became more common. Instead of physically transporting stacks of cash, institutions could move money electronically. This made high-denomination bills less necessary. Why carry a bulky stack of $500 bills when you could send millions with a simple transaction? But there was another, darker reason. High-denomination bills became increasingly attractive to criminals. Think about it. If you're trying to move illegal money, whether it's from organized crime, drug trafficking, or tax evasion, you want to do it in the most efficient way possible. A suitcase filled with $100 bills holds a lot of money. But a suitcase filled with $500 or $1,000 bills? That's exponentially more. In fact, using larger bills made it easier to hide and transport massive amounts of cash without drawing attention. And as crime networks grew more sophisticated, these bills became tools of the trade. By the 1960s, the U.S. government started to take notice. In 1969, the Federal Reserve made a quiet but significant decision. It would officially discontinue high-denomination bills, including the $500 bill. This wasn't a dramatic public announcement. There were no headlines screaming about the end of an era. It was more of a strategic move, a recognition that these bills were no longer necessary for legitimate use and that their risks outweighed their benefits. At the time, there were still millions of dollars worth of these bills in circulation. But once the decision was made, no new $500 bills were printed. Slowly, as people deposited them into banks or used them in transactions, they were taken out of circulation and destroyed. And just like that, the $500 bill began to disappear. But here's the interesting part. It never technically became illegal. Even today, if you somehow have a genuine $500 bill, it's still legal tender. That means it still holds its face value of $500. You could, in theory, walk into a store and try to spend it. But realistically, most people wouldn't even recognize it, and many businesses would refuse it simply because they've never seen one before. Instead, these bills have taken on a completely different role. They've become collector's items, and not just any collector's items, valuable ones. Depending on the condition, rarity, and series, a $500 bill today can be worth far more than its face value. Some sell for $1,000, $2,000, or even more at auctions. In pristine condition, rare versions can fetch several $1,000s. What was once just a piece of currency is now a piece of history. So how many are left? Estimates suggest that only a small fraction of the original $500 bills still exist today. While exact numbers are hard to pin down, it's believed that fewer than 100,000 are still out there. Many of them in private collections, vaults, or museums. Compared to the billions of $1 and $100 bills in circulation, that's incredibly rare. And this raises an interesting question. Could the $500 bill ever come back? Technically, yes. The US government has the authority to print high-denomination currency again, but in reality, it's highly unlikely. Why? And because the world has moved even further away from physical cash. Today, we live in a digital economy. Payments happen instantly. People use credit cards, mobile apps, and online banking for everything from buying coffee to transferring thousands of dollars. Even large financial transactions rarely involve physical cash anymore. In fact, cash itself is becoming less common in many parts of the world. And when it comes to crime, large bills are still seen as a risk. Governments prefer systems that are traceable, trackable, and harder to exploit. Reintroducing something like a $500 bill could make it easier for illegal activities to operate under the radar, something authorities are keen to avoid. Interestingly, this isn't just an American story. Other countries have also phased out high-denomination bills for similar reasons. So the European Central Bank stopped issuing the 500 euro note, often nicknamed the Bin Laden, because it was known to exist, but rarely seen in everyday transactions. The reasoning was almost identical: reduce crime, increase transparency, and adapt to a digital financial system. So in many ways, the disappearance of the $500 bill isn't just about one piece of currency. It reflects a much bigger shift in how money works, from physical to digital. But there's still something fascinating about it, and maybe that's why people are still so intrigued by it today. It's not just about the money, it's about the story. The $500 bill didn't disappear overnight. It wasn't banned. It wasn't destroyed all at once. It simply faded away. If history has shown us anything, it's that nothing stays the same forever. The $500 bill is one of those things. A forgotten giant of the financial world, a symbol of a different era, and a reminder that even the most powerful forms of money can become obsolete. So the next time you pull out a $20 bill or tap your phone to pay, just remember, there was once a time when a single bill could be worth $500. And it was completely normal. And now, it's a rare piece of history, hidden in collections, locked in vaults, or maybe sitting quietly somewhere, waiting to be discovered. And that's what makes it so fascinating, not just what it was, but what it became.
If someone handed you a $1,000 bill today, most people would assume it was fake. Cashiers might refuse it. Banks would stare at it for a moment. Some people wouldn't even know the United States ever printed one. Yet the $1,000 bill was once completely real. It circulated legally, appeared in banks across the country, and even carried the face of a former American president. So what happened to it? Why would a country print extremely high-value currency and then quietly let it disappear? The story of the $1,000 bill isn't really about paper money. It's about how the financial system changed, how technology replaced physical cash, and how governments slowly realized that the bigger the bill, the easier it becomes for crime to move money invisibly. To understand why the $1,000 bill vanished, we have to go back to a time when moving money was much harder than it is today. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, banks didn't have digital transfers, instant wires, or online ledgers. If a financial institution needed to move large sums of money from one place to another, they often had to move the physical currency itself. That meant bundles of cash traveling between banks. This is where large denomination bills became useful. Instead of shipping suitcases filled with hundreds of small bills, banks could use high-value notes. The United States printed several of these large denominations, including the $500, $1,000, $5,000, and even a $10,000 bill. These weren't meant for everyday shopping. They were primarily tools for banks and large financial transactions. The $1,000 bill itself most commonly featured the face of Grover Cleveland, the only US president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. Cleveland wasn't chosen for any particular connection to money. Like many banknote portraits, the choice reflected recognition and historical significance rather than symbolism. During the early 20th century, the $1,000 bill had a simple purpose. It made moving money easier. Imagine a bank transferring $1 million in cash. Using $10 bills would require 100,000 pieces of paper. With $1,000 bills, the same amount could fit neatly into a much smaller stack. For institutions dealing with large financial settlements, this efficiency mattered. But something important began to change in the financial world after the 1930s. Banks began adopting faster and more secure methods of transferring funds. The creation of centralized banking systems and electronic record-keeping made it possible to move enormous sums of money without physically moving cash at all. Instead of trucks carrying money between banks, transactions increasingly happened through ledgers and electronic communication. This change made large bills less necessary. At the same time, another problem began to emerge. High-denomination currency turned out to be extremely convenient for illegal activity. Think about it for a moment. If someone wants to move $1 million using $20 bills, they would need 50,000 notes. That amount of cash is heavy, bulky, and difficult to hide. But if that same amount were stored in $1,000 bills, it would require only 1,000 pieces of paper. The difference is enormous. Large bills make it dramatically easier to transport and conceal huge amounts of money. And that made them attractive not just to banks, but also to criminals involved in organized crime, tax evasion, and black market transactions. By the mid-20th century, governments were becoming increasingly aware of this issue. In 1969, the United States government made a major decision. The Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve announced that several high-denomination bills would be discontinued. This included the $500, $1,000, $5,000, and $10,000 notes. The reasoning was simple. These bills were no longer needed for legitimate banking purposes, and their existence made large criminal transactions easier. Stopping production wouldn't eliminate crime, of course. But removing extremely high-value currency made it harder to move large amounts of illicit money in cash. So the government stopped printing them. But here's an interesting detail. The $1,000 bill was never officially canceled. It remains legal tender in the United States. That means if you somehow found one today, it would still technically be worth $1,000 in spending power. Of course, no one would actually spend it. Over time, these bills became extremely rare. Many were returned to the Federal Reserve and destroyed as part of normal currency replacement. Others were kept by collectors. Today, surviving $1,000 bills are worth far more than their face value. Depending on the condition and the specific series, some can sell for several $1,000s at auctions. In other words, the bill that once represented large transactions now functions mostly as a historical artifact. The disappearance of the $1,000 bill reflects a broader shift in how money works. For most of human history, money had to exist physically. Coins, notes, precious metals, value was something you could hold in your hand. Large bills made sense in that world because they reduced the physical burden of transporting wealth. But modern finance operates differently. Today, trillions of dollars move through electronic systems every single day. Banks settle transactions using digital records. Businesses transfer funds across continents in seconds. Even everyday purchases increasingly happen through cards, phones, or online payments. In this environment, large physical bills are unnecessary. In fact, many governments now view them as liabilities rather than conveniences. High-value currency can enable tax evasion, corruption, and underground economies because it allows large sums to circulate outside the banking system. That's why several countries have taken similar steps. For example, the European Central Bank decided to stop issuing the 500 euro note, often nicknamed the Bin Laden bill, because authorities believed it was frequently used in criminal transactions while rarely seen by ordinary citizens. The pattern is clear. As financial systems become more digital and transparent, governments tend to reduce the role of extremely large banknotes. But the disappearance of the $1,000 bill also reveals something psychological about money. Large physical bills carry a certain mystique. Seeing a $1,000 note feels different from seeing numbers on a screen. It represents wealth in a tangible form. That tangible presence once made money feel powerful and real. Today, most wealth exists as data. When someone transfers money online, no paper moves. No coins change hands. Numbers shift between accounts in a database somewhere. The $1,000 bill belongs to a different era, when moving money meant physically moving paper. And that's why it slowly faded away. It didn't disappear overnight. It simply became unnecessary. Banks no longer needed it. Governments didn't want criminals using it. Digital systems replaced the logistical problems it once solved. So the bill quietly left circulation. What remains are a few surviving pieces of currency, sitting in collections, museums, and auction houses. They serve as reminders of a financial system that once relied on stacks of paper to move enormous sums of money. If you ever see a $1,000 bill in person, it will probably be behind glass, not because it's illegal, but because it belongs to a version of money that the modern world has mostly left behind. Money is one of those things we rarely stop to question. We use it every day. Tap a card, send a payment, check a balance on a screen, and it all feels normal. But once you start looking closer, you realize how quickly the idea of money keeps changing. The $1,000 bill feels strange today, but not long ago it was completely ordinary. And that makes you wonder what parts of today's financial world will seem just as strange in the future. Will physical cash disappear entirely? Will people one day look at paper money the same way we now look at $1,000 bills? If you enjoy exploring these kinds of questions and the strange stories behind everyday things, let me know in the comments what topic we should dig into next. There are a lot of forgotten pieces of history hiding in plain sight. And if you like content that looks at money, technology, and the systems we take for granted, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next video. Because sometimes the most interesting questions aren't about what exists today. They're about what quietly disappeared, and what might be next.
Have you ever taken a close look at a $1 bill? Not just glanced at it, but really studied it. Because hidden in plain sight is one of the most mysterious and debated symbols in modern history. An all-seeing eye floating above an unfinished pyramid. It looks ancient, powerful, and honestly, a little unsettling. So the question is, why is that symbol there? Is it just decoration, or does it mean something deeper? Today, we're going to break down the real story behind the eye on the $1 bill and separate fact from conspiracy. First, let's talk about what you're actually looking at. That symbol is officially called the Eye of Providence. It shows an eye, usually surrounded by rays of light watching from above. Beneath it sits a pyramid with 13 levels. And yes, every detail here matters. And the pyramid isn't complete. The top is missing. Floating above it, the eye seems to observe everything below. Around it, there are Latin phrases, annuit coeptis and novus ordo seclorum. Translated, they roughly mean, he approves our undertakings, and a new order of the ages. Already, that sounds pretty intense. Now here's where things get interesting. A lot of people immediately connect this symbol to secret societies, especially the Illuminati. The idea is that a hidden group of powerful elites controls the world, and they've left their mark right there on the dollar bill. It sounds like something out of a movie, but millions of people genuinely believe it. The eye watching everything, the unfinished pyramid representing control or dominance. It all feels too symbolic to be random. But is there any truth to that? To understand the real meaning, we need to go back to the late 1700s, the founding of the United States. The symbol didn't just appear randomly. It comes from something called the Great Seal of the United States. In 1776, the same year America declared independence, a committee was formed to design an official seal that would represent the new nation. This wasn't done overnight. In fact, it took 6 years and multiple redesigns before the final version was approved in 1782. The Eye of Providence was a symbol that already existed long before America. It had been used in Christian art for centuries. Back then, it represented the Eye of God, a divine presence watching over humanity. The triangle around the eye symbolized the Holy Trinity. So when the designers included it in the Great Seal, they weren't thinking about secret societies or global control. They were expressing a belief that a higher power was guiding and protecting the nation. Now let's talk about the pyramid. Why a pyramid? Why not something more American like an eagle or a flag? Well, the pyramid was chosen for a very specific reason. It represents strength and durability. Think about it. Pyramids have stood for thousands of years. They don't crumble easily. So the message here was simple. The United States was meant to be strong, stable, and built to last. The 13 steps of the pyramid represent the original 13 colonies. And the unfinished top? That symbolizes that the country was still growing, still evolving. It wasn't complete yet, and in many ways, it still isn't. When you combine the pyramid and the eye, the meaning becomes clearer. The idea is that the nation is a work in progress, built on a strong foundation and guided by a higher power. That's the official explanation. But of course, that hasn't stopped people from questioning it. One of the biggest reasons this symbol fuels conspiracy theories is because of how it looks. Let's be honest, an eye floating above a pyramid does feel mysterious. It doesn't look like something you'd expect on everyday currency. And then there's the timing. The symbol didn't actually appear on the $1 bill until 1935, over 150 years after the Great Seal was created. That gap raises questions. Why wait so long to include it? What changed? In 1935, during the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the design of the dollar bill was updated. That's when the reverse side of the Great Seal, including the eye and pyramid, was added. Interestingly, Roosevelt had connections to Freemasonry, another group often linked to secret symbolism. Some people believe this wasn't a coincidence. They argue that powerful individuals used this opportunity to embed hidden messages into the currency. But again, there's no solid evidence proving that theory. Historians generally agree that the addition was more about national identity and symbolism than secret agendas. The Great Seal had always been an important emblem of the United States, and adding it to the dollar bill made sense from a design and patriotic perspective. Still, the symbolism itself is powerful enough to keep the theories alive. The phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, for example, is often misunderstood. Many people translate it as New World Order, which sounds like something out of a conspiracy documentary. But the actual meaning is closer to a new era, or a new order of the ages. It was meant to celebrate the beginning of a new nation, not the creation of a secret global government. Another detail people point to is the number 13. It appears everywhere on the dollar bill. 13 steps on the pyramid, 13 stars above the eagle, 13 stripes on the shield. Some see this as a hidden code, but in reality, it simply represents the original 13 colonies. It's repeated throughout the design as a reminder of the country's origins. So why do these conspiracy theories persist? Because humans are naturally drawn to mystery. When we see symbols we don't fully understand, we start connecting dots. We look for patterns, hidden meanings, secret messages. And when something as everyday as money carries such unusual imagery, it becomes the perfect subject for speculation. There's also the influence of pop culture. Movies, books, and social media have amplified these ideas. The Illuminati, secret societies, hidden elites, they've become part of modern storytelling. And the dollar bill with its eye and pyramid fits perfectly into that narrative. It's visual proof, at least on the surface, that something deeper might be going on. But here's the reality. Not everything mysterious is a conspiracy. Sometimes symbols are exactly what they appear to be, representations of beliefs, values, and history. The Eye of Providence wasn't created to control or intimidate. It was meant to inspire, to suggest that the nation was under divine guidance, that its journey had purpose and direction. At the same time, it's completely fair to question things. Healthy skepticism is important. Just because there's an official explanation doesn't mean you have to accept it blindly. But it's also important to separate curiosity from assumption. The line between asking questions and jumping to conclusions can be thin. So the next time you hold a $1 bill, take a moment to really look at it. Notice the details, the symbols, the phrases. Think about the history behind it. A group of founders trying to represent a new nation, choosing imagery that would stand the test of time. Whether you see it as a symbol of faith, strength, or something more mysterious, one thing is certain. It's not just random design. It's a piece of storytelling, printed, circulated, and used every single day without most people ever thinking twice about it. And maybe that's what makes it so fascinating. The fact that something so ordinary can carry so much meaning, so much debate, so much mystery. Because at the end of the day, the eye on the dollar bill isn't just watching over a pyramid. It's watching over an idea of a nation still being built, still evolving, still unfinished. And whether you believe it's guided by history, by people, or by something greater, that's up to you.
Ever held a US dollar bill and wondered, where did this actually come from? Not just the physical paper in your hand, but the entire system behind it. Because the truth is, money isn't just printed. It's created through a complex, almost hidden process that most people never fully understand. And once you do understand it, you'll never look at money the same way again. Let's start with the physical side. When people think of money being made, they imagine giant printing presses pumping out stacks of cash. And they're not wrong. In the United States, paper money is produced by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, often called the BEP. This is where billions of dollars are printed every year. But here's something surprising. Most of that money isn't printed to create new wealth. It's actually printed to replace old, worn-out bills. In fact, around 90% of printed currency each year is just replacing damaged notes. And the paper? It's not really paper. US dollars are made from a blend of 75% cotton and 25% linen, which gives them that distinct texture and durability. That's why a dollar bill can survive being crumpled, washed, and folded hundreds of times without falling apart. Each bill also includes advanced security features like watermarks, color-shifting ink, microprinting, and embedded security threads to prevent counterfeiting. But here's where things start to get interesting. Physical cash, the kind you can hold, is only a tiny fraction of the total money in the US economy. In fact, most money today doesn't exist as paper at all. It exists digitally, as numbers on screens inside banks. So if money isn't mostly printed, how is it actually created? This is where the Federal Reserve comes in. The Federal Reserve, often called the Fed, is the central bank of the United States. And it plays a huge role in controlling the money supply. But it doesn't just print money and hand it out. Instead, it uses a system that involves banks, loans, and interest. Here's the basic idea. When the Federal Reserve wants to increase the amount of money in the economy, it doesn't start printing stacks of cash. Instead, it creates money digitally and uses it to buy government bonds. These bonds are essentially IOUs from the US government. When the Fed buys them, it injects money into the financial system. Now, that money goes to banks. And banks don't just sit on it, they lend it out. This is where the real magic, or some might say, the real illusion happens. When you deposit money into a bank, the bank doesn't keep all of it locked away. Instead, it uses something called fractional reserve banking. This means the bank only keeps a small percentage of your deposit in reserve and lends out the rest. Let's say you deposit $1,000 into your bank account. The bank might keep $100 as a reserve and lend out $900 to someone else. That $900 gets deposited into another account, where another bank keeps a portion and lends out the rest again. This process repeats over and over, effectively multiplying the original $1,000 into several thousand dollars circulating in the economy. In other words, banks are creating money just by lending. This is why some economists say that money is essentially created out of debt. Every time a loan is issued, whether it's for a house, a car, or a business, that loan creates new money in the system. But it also creates an obligation to pay it back, usually with interest, and that interest is key. Because it means there's always more money owed than actually exists. Think about that for a second. If all money is created through loans, and every loan has interest attached, then the total amount of debt in the system will always be greater than the total amount of money. This creates a constant need for more loans, more money creation, and continuous economic growth just to keep the system running smoothly. Now, you might be wondering, how much money are we talking about here? As of recent estimates, the total US money supply is in the tens of trillions of dollars. Yet only a small percentage of that exists as physical cash. The rest is digital, created through lending, banking systems, and central bank operations. And when major events happen, like financial crises or global pandemics, the process of money creation can accelerate dramatically. Take 2008, for example. During the global financial crisis, the Federal Reserve injected massive amounts of money into the economy to stabilize the system. Then again, in 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, trillions of dollars were added to support businesses, individuals, and markets. This kind of large-scale money creation is often referred to as quantitative easing. It's a tool used by central banks to boost the economy during tough times. But it also raises concerns, especially about inflation. Because when more money is created, each individual dollar can become less valuable. That's why prices tend to rise over time. It's not just that things are getting more expensive, it's also that money itself is losing purchasing power. For example, decades ago, you could buy a full meal with just a few dollars. Today, that same meal might cost 10 times as much. Part of that is economic growth and demand, but a big part of it is the increase in the money supply. Now, let's go back to the physical side for a moment. Because even though digital money dominates, printed cash still plays an important role. Every US dollar bill has a unique serial number and goes through strict quality control. The printing process itself is incredibly detailed and precise, involving multiple stages of engraving, printing, inspection, and cutting. A single bill can go through dozens of steps before it's ready to be circulated. And coins? Those are produced by a completely different entity, the US Mint. Coins are made from metal alloys and are also produced in massive quantities each year. But just like paper money, coins represent only a small slice of the total money supply. So now you might be thinking, if money is mostly digital, and banks can create it through lending, and the central bank can create it through policy, then what actually gives money its value? The answer is surprisingly simple and a bit unsettling. Trust. Money has value because people believe it has value. The US dollar is what's known as a fiat currency, which means it's not backed by a physical commodity like gold or silver. Instead, its value comes from the trust people have in the US government and its economy. This wasn't always the case. In the past, the US dollar was tied to gold through something called the gold standard. But in 1971, the US officially moved away from that system, making the dollar fully fiat. Since then, money has been based entirely on belief, stability, and economic strength. And despite all the complexity, this system has worked, at least so far. The US dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency, used in international trade, held by central banks, and trusted across the globe. But it's not without criticism. Some argue that the system allows too much control in the hands of central banks and financial institutions. Others worry about long-term inflation, rising debt levels, and the sustainability of continuous money creation. And then there's the rise of alternatives, like cryptocurrencies, which aim to create money outside of traditional systems. But that's a whole different story. At its core, the process of how US dollars are made is a mix of physical production, digital creation, economic policy, and human psychology. It's not just about printing money, it's about managing an entire system that balances growth, stability, and trust. So the next time you see a dollar bill, remember, what you're holding isn't just a piece of cotton and ink. It's a symbol of a vast, interconnected system that runs on belief, backed by institutions, and constantly evolving. And maybe the most fascinating part? Most people use it every single day, without ever realizing how it's actually made. If this changed the way you see money, hit like and subscribe for more eye-opening content. Drop a comment. What shocked you the most? And share this with someone who still thinks money is just printed. Trust me, they need to see this. Why is US money green? It's one of those questions people rarely ask until someone finally points it out. Think about it. The world's most powerful currency, the dollar, is printed almost entirely in green ink. Green numbers, green backgrounds, green symbols. But why? Was it random? Tradition? Or is there a deeper story hiding behind the color of money? To answer that, we have to go back to the early days of the United States, long before modern banking, before digital transactions, and before the dollar became the global king of currency. In the 1800s, money in America looked nothing like it does today. Banknotes were printed by hundreds of private banks, each producing their own designs. Some bills had blue ink, others red, brown, even black. There was no standard look. If anything, American currency looked like a chaotic art project rather than a unified financial system. And that chaos created a huge problem: counterfeiting. In the mid-19th century, fake money was everywhere. Some historians estimate that nearly 1/3 of all currency circulating in the United States at the time was counterfeit. Criminals discovered that printing fake notes was easier than robbing a bank. There were even guidebooks sold to merchants explaining how to identify fake bills because the designs were constantly changing. Then came the Civil War in 1861. The US government suddenly needed enormous amounts of money to fund the war effort. For the first time, the federal government began printing a standardized national currency called greenbacks. And yes, that name would end up shaping the color of American money forever. But here's the twist. The original reason wasn't patriotic symbolism or aesthetic choice. It was technology. At the time, green ink was one of the most durable inks available. It resisted fading from sunlight and chemical exposure far better than other colors. Remember, people carried cash in sweaty pockets, dusty wallets, and rough environments. Bills had to survive years of use. Green ink simply lasted longer. But durability wasn't the only advantage. Green ink was also extremely difficult to replicate with the printing technology available to counterfeiters. During the 1800s, photography and copying technology were primitive. Counterfeiters often used black and white photographic methods to replicate bills. But green ink created a problem. Those reproduction techniques couldn't accurately capture the color or the subtle details embedded in the ink. In other words, green made money harder to fake. So while people today associate green with wealth, prosperity, and success, the original decision was much more practical. Green was simply the best defense against counterfeiters. Another interesting factor was cost. After the Civil War, the government had large quantities of green pigment left over from military printing supplies. Instead of wasting it, the Treasury used the remaining ink to print currency. In other words, one of the most iconic design choices in financial history may have started as a budget decision. But over time, something fascinating happened. Green money became psychologically powerful. Humans are incredibly sensitive to color symbolism, and green carries unique associations. It represents growth, stability, and renewal. Think about nature, grass, trees, plants. Green signals life and continuity. When people see green currency, it subtly reinforces the idea that money is stable and enduring. Whether intentionally or not, the color helped build trust in the US dollar. And trust is everything in finance. Money itself has no inherent value. A dollar bill is just paper and ink. Its power comes entirely from collective belief. People accept it because they trust that others will accept it too. That shared belief is what turns colored paper into economic power. The green color, repeated across billions of banknotes for more than a century, became a visual symbol of that trust. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. By the early 1900s, printing technology had improved dramatically. Counterfeit detection techniques evolved, and new inks and security methods were developed. Technically, the government could have changed the color of US money at any time. Blue, purple, red, any color was possible. Yet the Treasury never switched. Why? Because by then, green had become part of America's financial identity. The dollar wasn't just currency anymore, it was branding. The green color was instantly recognizable around the world. Traders, bankers, travelers, and governments all knew what American money looked like. Changing it could create confusion, or worse, weaken the symbolic stability of the dollar. So the color stayed. In fact, the US dollar became so strongly associated with green that the phrase greenbacks remained in popular use for generations. Even today, people casually refer to money as green. But here's something most people don't realize. Modern US currency actually contains multiple colors now. Take a look at newer bills like the $20 or $100. You'll see hints of blue, orange, and yellow security elements embedded in the design. These colors are part of advanced anti-counterfeiting technology, including color-shifting ink and security threads that glow under ultraviolet light. Despite these innovations, the core green color remains dominant. And that's not just tradition, it's psychology and recognition. Think about it this way. If you suddenly saw a purple dollar bill, you'd probably question whether it was real. Even if the government officially changed the color, people might hesitate to accept it. After more than 150 years, green equals real money in the American mind. That kind of visual conditioning is powerful. Interestingly, the United States is somewhat unique in this regard. Many countries frequently redesign their currency with bold colors and new artistic styles. Canadian dollars, for example, feature bright blues, reds, and purples. European euros are multicolored. Australian banknotes look almost like pieces of modern art. American money, by comparison, looks conservative, almost stubbornly traditional. Part of that is intentional. The US dollar isn't just used inside the United States. It's the world's primary reserve currency. Governments hold it. Global trade relies on it. In some countries facing economic instability, people even prefer holding US dollars instead of their own national currency. Because of this global role, consistency matters. Radical visual changes could introduce uncertainty, and financial systems hate uncertainty. So, the green stays. There's also another subtle advantage to green that designers discovered over time. Contrast. The intricate engravings on US currency, those complex patterns, portraits, and tiny lines, show up extremely clearly against green backgrounds. This clarity helps both humans and machines identify legitimate notes. So the color that started as a practical ink choice evolved into a security feature, a psychological symbol, and a global brand. But perhaps the most ironic part of the story is this: the color of money has influenced the way we talk about wealth itself. In English, people say they're chasing green. Businesses track their green numbers. Hollywood movies talk about big green. The color has become shorthand for financial success. Yet that association didn't come from ancient symbolism or economic theory. It came from leftover ink. A printing decision made during the Civil War ended up shaping how generations of people visualize money. Something as simple as pigment choice quietly influenced language, culture, and financial identity for more than a century. And that's the fascinating thing about everyday objects. We rarely question them. We handle money constantly, yet almost no one stops to wonder why it looks the way it does. But behind that familiar green color lies a story of war, counterfeiting, technology, psychology, and global finance. The next time you see a dollar bill, take a closer look. The color isn't just decoration, it's history printed in green ink. If you enjoyed discovering the hidden story behind the color of money, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves strange history, and subscribe for more fascinating facts. And tell me in the comments, what everyday mystery should we uncover next? Your idea might be the next video.